Hello, and thank you for joining me. I've chosen today to give you a slightly different perspective on the vicarage as my background. I hope you like it. I'm going to be looking today at two of the readings set for our lectionary this Sunday. The first comes from the 34th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, prophet, and the second from the end of Matthew's Gospel. If you haven't looked at them yet, you might like to do that. You'll find them on the Benefice website and read through them before you listen to me. And if you do that, you'll know that today we celebrate the feast of Christ the King, otherwise known rather more prosaically as the last Sunday before Advent. For me, that name evokes an image from the Revelation of John, which we've been reading for our midweek services for a few weeks now, of Christ in majesty, seated at the right hand of God. And as befits this, our gospel reading is the apocalyptic vision from the end of Matthew's Gospel, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him. Then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. As I say in our lectionary, it's paired with the passage from the prophet Ezekiel, headed in many Bibles, God the True Shepherd. I think the similarity with the Matthew passage is obvious, and if you find echoes there of the 23rd Psalm, I'm sure that isn't coincidental either. But however much we may use the 23rd Psalm as a source of comfort to the troubled, to the dying, and to the bereaved, there is a fundamental difference between the Ezekiel and Matthew stories, which I find distinctly uncomfortable. In Matthew 25, the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Fine if you're a sheep, not so pleasant if you're a goat. Surprisingly, no mention here of outer darkness or wailing and gnashing of teeth, which Matthew frequently favours as the fate of evildoers, but external punishment nonetheless. But the thing is, the sheep and the goats have no say in their future, in their fate, in the judgment that awaits, no choice to make. The sheep have always been sheep. The goats have always been goats. Their fate is decided for them. In Ezekiel, by contrast, there are only sheep. The shepherd will gather all the sheep, the lost and the strayed, together into their own land. He will feed them in rich pasture. They will lie down on good grazing land, and God himself will be their shepherd. He will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the fat and the strong he will destroy. The strong have pushed with flank and shoulder. They have butted at the weak with their horns. The judgment here will be between sheep and sheep, and will depend on how each has treated their fellows. And again, it will not be so pleasant for those that have made themselves fat, while their fellows became lean. The concept of social justice and the fate of those, particularly those in positions of power, who do not put its principles into practice, is perhaps more common in the Old Testament than we often think. But the implied commandment to Ezekiel's sheep to love your neighbour takes us straight forward to Jesus' teaching. I think we can imagine the fat sheep asking, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" And receiving the equally New Testament, equally Christ-like answer, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. So, imagine one day that you meet Jesus, not seated in majesty at God's right hand in heaven, but crouched, shivering in some city centre doorway, desperate for a meal or a hot drink. We wouldn't hesitate, would we, to take care of him, to take him in? But my friends, this is his message in Matthew 25. Every time we pass such a figure, we pass Christ himself. We are not sheep and goats. We are all sheep, the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. And it's our choice. Such is the kingdom over which Christ is now king. During Lent once, I came across a poem, The Coming by Iris Thomas. I thought then it was a Passiontide poem, but it comes back to me as I reflect on today's readings. And it reminds me that Advent also means coming. So maybe it's a poem for now. And God held in his hand a small globe. Look, he said. The sun looked. Far off, as through water, he saw a scorched land of fierce colour. The light burned there, the crusted buildings cast their shadows. A bright serpent, a river, uncoiled itself, radiant with slime. On a bare hill, a bare tree saddened the sky. Many people held out their thin arms to it, as though waiting for a vanished April to return to its crossed boughs. The sun watched them. Let me go there, he said. A very different image of Christ the King, but one I think which does fit with our readings. I twice heard Bishop then, now Archbishop Stephen Cottrell, lecture on preaching. One of the things he said both times was that you should always write the last sentence of your sermon first, and then, as it were, work back to it. And I get what he meant completely. But often, for me, it just doesn't work that way. You open up the readings, and you find they lead you to a place where you hadn't expected to go. And today's a case in point. So my sermon today has no last sentence. The last sentence is for you. What words, what image stuck in your mind as I was speaking? Maybe it's the small globe in the poem. Let me go there, the sun said. What are you going to say? Maybe it's the figure crouched, shivering in the doorway, his eyes asking the question, sheep or goat, fat sheep or lean? What are you going to say to him? Well, next Sunday is the first in Advent. We stand at the brink of a new year for the church. And God knows we need something different from last year. So, I leave you with some questions to ponder. What do we want from that year? Where do we want to be by the end of it? And what are we each prepared to put in to make that happen? Amen.